Hi everyone, my name is Sophia Wood. Welcome to this Q&A session of our Situ lectures with Éadin Omani. I am the country manager for Operation Wallaceia's Ecuador programs, and I also run an initiative called Friends of Wallacea, helping OPWAL partners develop sustainable tourism operations that support their conservation throughout the year, even when OPWAL is not in the field. Éadin is an MRes student in marine mammal genetics at the University of St. Andrews, and she's also worked on multiple OPWAL projects, including in Ecuador in 2018, South Africa in 2016. So she will be chatting with us a bit today about her research in northern British Columbia with humpback whales and how she's using drones to learn a bit more about them. We've received a bunch of great questions today. So I'll be asking Éadin and giving her a chance to answer, but you can also send in any questions throughout our talk to xsitu@opwal.com, even throughout the talk. And you can also send questions via the chat on YouTube. So if you're watching through the OPWAL website and you can't see the chat, just click the YouTube button and it'll open up in a separate tab. So thanks so much for joining us today, Éadin.
Thanks for having me.
So I've gotten some great questions, especially about your drones. So did you fly the drone yourself, and how long did it take you to learn to pilot a drone? Also, we've got a similar question about whether or not the whales actually know that the drone is there when you're trying to capture their blow.
Yeah, so I did pilot the drones myself. Last field season was my first time properly learning how to pilot drones, as well as you would have seen if you got a chance to watch the lecture that I gave, a matter of catching the drone out of the air from the vessel as well. So it was a bit of a multitasking job, which is easy on land and gets a little bit more challenging when you're on a moving vessel that's drifting in the wind, but thankfully everything went well. How I learned, you have to be very careful with flying drones depending on which country you're going to be piloting in, because regulations really differ from one country to the next. We did a license specific for British Columbia, whereas in Ireland, for example, the restrictions are very different, where you don't need specific licenses for certain types of drones. So you have to kind of look into it carefully.
Got it.
And then in terms of the whales knowing that the drone is there, so I'm certain they do. We did choose a much smaller drone model. So we were working predominantly with the DJI Mavic 2 Pro, which is quite a small and therefore quieter drone, because we were trying to be as least invasive for the whales as possible. But one of the things that we did was really closely monitor if we could tell that there was some kind of a behavioral response from the whale. So as I'm piloting the drone, I can see live what the drone sees. And then from there, we have a pre-designed scale that is something we based off of existing research from other teams that basically ranks what a behavioral response is and how extreme that response is. So we're constantly monitoring it, but always kind of what I imagine it being like is maybe mosquito buzzing and maybe a little bit irritating. Because we saw such few responses, it wasn't as if it's this big, heavy, huge, noisy thing in the air, because you have to remember whales are huge. Humpbacks, you're talking between 13 and 15 meters in length. So very different to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really interesting. I like the mosquito comparison.
Of course, we can never know for certain, and it's something that we're constantly trying to keep an eye on and to develop to make sure that we are being non-invasive, because that is the goal.
When you did see reactions, what kind of reactions were they?
So the few times that I saw reactions, one was flying over humpback, and the humpback just turning and looking up at the drone. So you could see, it was incredible, of course, to see, you could see the whale's eye looking up, almost just, what is that? Just checking it out. And the other reaction that we saw was when they were resting whales. So humpbacks, a few times that especially in this fjord system, they rest or sleep just like floating on the surface, and they're taking shallower breaths, and they tend to be in this air, floating in the same place for quite a while. And that's when I saw quite a few responses where the whale would wake up and then it would take a more forceful breath, show its tail and go for a dive. So we decided quite early on that when we see a resting whale, like, let the resting whale lie, so we never took any samples from sleeping whales.
Okay, wow, very cool. So you mentioned in your lecture a little bit about what it was like to live on this basically uninhabited island. And obviously working with Opwell, you've had opportunities to live in other really remote, beautiful areas of the world. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit more and give tips on how to survive and thrive on a remote island or any of these remote places for long periods of time while you're doing your research. And were there any adaptations you had to make to your lifestyle to overcome this challenge or kind of make it more comfortable?
That's a great question. I think one of the key things that I found when I was in the field, regardless really of where I was to make sure that I was keeping up an exercise routine, because particularly the Finn Island Research Station, you're perched on a rock on this uninhabited island, so it's not as if you have very easy access to trails for running or that type of thing. So sometimes I've had to get creative with the exercise I try and do, but I really think that that's an important thing, to keep that regular exercise as part of your routine, just because it also balances your quite intense work life, because you're living and working in the same place. You have to make sure that you still keep a balance. And the other thing that helped with that was reading. So at Finn Island in particular, most people who came out would bring a book or two, and then we would trade. And again, that just keeps the variety there. But also, what I would say, particularly when you're spending long periods of time in a small remote field station with small teams, is to try and bring awareness to when you're having a bad day or you're feeling a little bit short-fused, which is, completely a normal thing, and being able to recognize when that happens and then pull yourself out of the social situation so that you're not introducing negative energy into that team environment, which of course, a positive, happy team means successful fieldwork. So I think that's also an important thing, definitely an adaptation, I would say, for thriving in the field.
That makes sense. And it seems like maybe something we should take into account as we're all dealing with quarantine right now. Actually, I feel your tips are pretty relevant in terms of all of us feeling quite isolated and living routines that are very different from our regular lives.
There are a lot of parallels you can draw between, staying at home now and being in a field situation. So I would definitely say, yeah.
Keep up the exercise routine and be very communicative with the people around you. Yeah.
And make time for yourself, I would say. So when you recognize that you're in a worse mood, it's okay to pull yourself back from those that you're sharing that very close environment with, and say, I just need a little bit of space to myself, whether that's reading, exercising, napping, whatever it is, and then come back into the social realm when you're feeling a little bit better. I think that can make a big difference.
That makes a lot of sense. Sounds like really good advice. So we've just got a question that's come through recently about your master's program, which I realize you're now basically doing online. But so how did you kind of research and find the master's program that you're in right now? And did you apply for the one that was posted by the university, who were already in collaboration with BC Whales, or did you approach the university about this collaboration? Finally, also, if you have any tips, anyone, for people who are looking for kind of MRes programs, that would be great.
Yeah, so the MRes, or sometimes called MSc Res, so it's a Master's by Research, which means that there are no obligatory taught courses within that. It's all research based, and generally then the program is based around one project. So the way that it worked for me, during my undergraduate, I had already heard about the Sea Mammal Research Unit of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland as being very well respected in the field of marine mammal science. And they also offer a taught master's program, which is also a one-year program, but they have more classes and then a smaller research element. Whereas for me, because I had volunteered with BC Wills a number of years ago and was continuing my work with them, my master's project idea actually came about through my work with BC Wills. So we developed the project idea. They had approached me about using drones in the field and what types of questions we would want to ask. And then the next step was for me to then pinpoint a supervisor that I thought their own personal expertise would be well suited to the project. And then I approached, so my supervisor is Oscar Gadjati, he's with the Scottish Oceans Institute. I approached him to say, listen, this is my project idea. This is something I would like to carry out. I'm already working with the organization. Is this something you would be interested in? And then you go through a couple of rounds of interviews and that type of thing. But in that sense, because it's a research focused project, it's a little bit different to just applying for an already advertised program that exists. So you kind of have to be a bit more. I guess it comes more from your end in that regard.
So when you apply for an MRes program, is it kind of like a PhD in that you basically kind of just have to pitch your project idea to them?
Exactly. So I would have written a research proposal originally, sent that to the supervisor that I had wanted to take me on as a student. And then we then expanded that proposal and essentially sent that into the university for the committees there to approve, and then you get interviewed. So yeah, it is very similar to the PhD process as far as I can tell. Sure. That's still ahead of me, but yeah, I think they're quite similar.
Right, that makes sense. And thank you for explaining a little bit more about what MRes means, because it's not, there's a research program. I realize it's quite common in the UK, but obviously we only do taught masters here, so it's quite a different kind of program. Do you have any tips for someone who would be looking, or someone who might be looking for interesting master's research programs?
Yeah, I think a good starting point is to ask yourself if you would really like to have a heavily research-focused program, such as an MRes, because it is very self-directed. I can avail of classes through the university, of course, throughout that program, but it's less structured than a top program might be. So I think a good place to start is ask yourself, do I want to take classes? Or do I want to strictly focus on research? And then from there, then if it is a research project, or an MRes that you want to pursue, or a PhD, let's say, to then of course think about the scale of the project that you would like to propose. So as opposed to it being a 1 or 2 month project, it needs to be large enough in its scope to be, it's a 30,000 word thesis, for example, that you write at the end of it. Ideally you're getting to a point where you can publish some of that work as peer-reviewed literature. So it's a little bit more extensive in terms of its focus when it comes to the research. So yeah, I would start with that, figure out what it is you want to do, where your interests lie. And then definitely a piece of advice that I was given that I found very helpful is to approach supervisors that, first of all, you find their work very interesting, and approach them early on to start a conversation with them to show that you're interested, and also just to get their input on the project idea too, because most supervisors are, get excited by students who are excited to do research and to pursue education. So I think it's always most people are open to have those conversations.
That's really good advice. So would you recommend, even if you're a couple of years before thinking about doing a master's, maybe scrolling through a few of the universities that are interesting to you, looking for top professors in the field that, even if you're quite far from thinking about it, but maybe just pinging them an email and seeing if you can start a little conversation there and start building those networks a few years before?
Sure, yeah. So for example, I think I was in the first year of my undergrad. I contacted the Sea Mammal Research Unit, or SMRU, in St. Andrews, just to say, listen, are there any classes I can take in my undergraduate or my undergraduate dissertation, for example? Is there a way that I can gear it towards me benefiting the most from then applying for master's programs? Just because I already had that idea in my head, But if you don't know, I think it is worth exploring early on what programs are out there, what master's research projects are out there, who is it that's supervising them, and what classes in your undergraduate can benefit you later on. So, whether you need to be doing coding classes or more statistics or, yeah.
Well, that was very proactive of you, but it's really helpful advice, I think, for a lot of people who are kind of, in undergraduate, thinking of going into undergraduate or just coming out of undergraduate and looking at, where they want to go next. Not everybody obviously has the idea as clearly as you, but I feel maybe having those conversations with people early on can give a little bit more clarity. So
Exactly.
did you end up taking any classes at St. Andrews through this MRes, or have you just done research?
So because of the pandemic, I'm in Ireland, not St. Andrews. The university is closed for in-person teaching. So right now I'm doing all of my work is just online at home, meaning that classes unfortunately aren't happening for me right now. But definitely, I mean, it's amazing how many free courses are available online. So I'm trying to avail of as many of those as I can fit into my schedule.
Nice. And it sounds like, and this is kind of related, so it sounds like you've kind of known that research was going to be a big part of your life, even from the first year of your undergraduate degree. So when and how did you realize that academia, this master's, and then eventually potentially a PhD was the path that you wanted to take?
I think that, like I said in my talk, having had field work experience definitely made me recognize how much I love being in the field. But there are, of course, opportunities where you become lab technicians or field technicians, where that is the heavier focus of what you do as your day to day. Whereas for me, the reason I kind of knew I wanted to pursue at least a research master's and taking that forward was because I was very interested in the entire research process. So I loved engaging with the very beginning of figuring out what those questions are that you want to ask, what are the questions that are important and can have an impact in terms of the conservation of that ecosystem or those species, taking that forward into the field work, then taking it forward, having your data and having to figure out how best to analyze that data, and then getting those answers out at the end and getting the opportunity to communicate those answers to the world of science through peer-reviewed literature, and then beyond that, of course, communicating your science to the public. So I think because I enjoyed that entire process, it seemed a natural next step for me to pursue research. And then, I mean, I'm still open. I think the important thing to also remember is that you're not necessarily pigeonholing yourself into one specific job, even though you're doing a research program.
Sure.
There are so many options available to you afterwards, or so I've been told. So
I'm sure there are. And I realize, obviously, I know you well from having worked with you in Ecuador and, through the last few years. But I think, obviously, you've always brought a big focus on conservation, outcomes, not just kind of the hard science of it, but also, working with the local communities and stuff like that. So it sounds like kind of this, multi-layered approach was a really good fit for you.
yeah. Definitely. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's, like you said, research is multifaceted. And as I mentioned in my lecture, it's not just about, species conservation. It goes beyond that.
Right. That's great. Well, that kind of leads into the next question that we've received, which is kind of what is the most important thing that you've learned in all of your field research experience?
Specifically, when it comes to field research, I would say that, in my experience anyway, there will always be unforeseen delays or challenges, as you yourself know with what you have to deal with in the field. I mean, you're working in remote places in the world, and no matter how hard you prepare, there will always be something that you could not have prepared for. So I think I've learned that you just have to let it happen sometimes. Specifically for me, with these blow samples, we had to freeze the samples in order to preserve the DNA. But Finn Island is completely off-grid, so it runs predominantly on solar power. And the amount of time I spent trying to repair our solar-powered freezer meant that I deem myself a qualified mechanic by the end of it. It was not something I ever expected to have to happen. But yeah, it delayed our field season by quite a long time, but it's just a part of field work.
Right, but you were able to get those samples in the end, weren't you? I remember you telling me about the freezer, getting boats across to different parts of, the BC to freeze these samples. So it sounds like you went through quite an adventure to get all that frozen.
Yeah, I have to say, Nicole and Bunker, who are great friends of ours and work with BC Whales very closely. They're members of the GitGat community. They came to the rescue. They allowed me to work from their home, freeze the samples in their household freezer. And when I got stuck a couple of times in Hartley Bay with bad weather, where Hartley Bay being the GitGat community centre, the nearest point of contact to the Finn Island Research Station, they let me stay with them while there was bad weather and I couldn't cross back on the vessel back to the cabin and stuff. So definitely they were the saviors of the 2019 field season and the blow sampling project. So definitely, I mean, as you know, it comes down to also the people who you're working with can save the day unexpectedly. So sometimes, because again, these are problems you don't plan for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the most beautiful parts of working in the field, isn't it? Just that people have to be so much friendlier and more cooperative. And obviously it's a very self-selecting group. But you end up in this level of cooperation that I think is rarely seen outside of these field research or field work experiences.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, so you talked, kind of to go on to a different topic, you talked a bit in your lecture about how whale conservation can have cascading effects on all of the wildlife in the region. So how do whales impact land mammals? For example, the spirit bears or wolves that live in the Great Bear rainforest.
So I guess the perhaps more obvious way that whales can benefit other species, and particularly land species, is as charismatic megafauna, whales can be a good indicator species for example, designing a protected area. So if you, because there is also so much research done on the various cetacean species, often when we have this much in-depth knowledge about a particular species, that information, that knowledge can be used for designing protected areas. And those protected areas then often can encompass, I mean, you'll have marine protected areas, but sometimes they also encompass land. So that's in a very practical way. But behind the scenes, whales are giant carbon sinks, actually. So I think it was National Geographic called them giant swimming trees, which I thought was brilliant because
cool.
So whales are worth essentially millions of dollars each because they sequester so much carbon throughout their lifetime, and when they die they sink to the ocean floor, essentially taking all of that carbon down to the ocean floor and out of the atmosphere. So they're actually major players in our fight against anthropogenic climate change, and of course by combating climate change, keeping that climate stable, they're protecting essentially all species on Earth. So it's kind of a roundabout way for whales to help land mammals, but a very important one.
Wow, I did not know that at all. That is such a cool whale fact.
Yep, giant swimming trees.
That's so interesting. I would have never thought, I guess their mass is so significant that they, just by consuming, that's fascinating. Mm-hmm. One thing you brought up that I thought was really interesting in your talk, and also came up in one of our questions, was kind of on the one hand, the miraculous growth of the humpback whale population over the last few years since they've stopped being hunted and have been much more protected globally. But on the other hand, this decrease in pregnancies that you've been noticing in humpback whales. So I was wondering kind of why do you think there's been a decrease in humpback whale breeding, reproduction, even though it seems like their population has been rebounding in some ways?
Yeah, so I guess to correct you a little bit, we don't know if there is a decline in the amount of pregnancies. What we do know is that we're seeing a decline in the number of calves that are arriving with their mothers.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if I explained that in my lecture, but humpbacks will give birth in their tropical breeding grounds, and the calf will generally stay at the mother's side for about a year, sometimes 2 years, and they migrate together. So by the time they reach the feeding ground, which is British Columbia is one of those, the calf is still at its mother's side. So because BC Wales has been working in the area for such a long time, they've been documenting the arrival of mothers and calves over time. And there has been a drastic decline in the last couple of years. The reason, we don't know the reason for that. First of all, we don't know, but we are trying to understand why that's happening. And we think that it might have to do with the natural carrying capacity in that habitat for humpbacks. So because they have made this recovery, they're estimated at potentially even outnumbering the pre-whaling population. So actually there's more humpbacks now than there were previous to that. So it's potentially carrying capacity. There's also been an increase in the number of fin whales, for example. So a competitor species, they have similar prey sources. So that could also be an element playing in that. But there are a host of theories, none of which are proven yet.
Wow. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I completely understand now. And I mean, it's obviously a very hard question to answer, but obviously, potentially on the bright side, maybe they have such a strong population that they're actually, self-regulating, basically, is what you're saying.
One thing I think I should add there very briefly is that I think it's a good example of why it's important to continue monitoring a species once it has recovered. So, of course, it's extremely important to dedicate time, money, and research into understanding endangered, studying endangered species and trying to protect those. But because these patterns exist and develop over time, even when a species has recovered, being able to continue monitoring their progress and step in when, new stressors, for example, are having an impact. I think that's very important.
That's a great point to add. So we're just coming up on 30 minutes. We're just about done. So I just wanted to let everyone know kind of this is a last chance to ask any questions either through the XC2 email address or on the YouTube chat. We'll be here for a few more minutes, just finishing up some last questions. But if there's any burning questions that come through in the next few minutes, we'll be sure to answer them. So I wanted to ask kind of, I know you worked at BC Wales before you worked for Apwala's staff in Ecuador, and then obviously you went back. So how did you first get involved with them?
So back in 2017, I went out to British Columbia for the first time as a volunteer. So I spent 2 months just, again, trying to gain more fieldwork experience, particularly get experience working with marine mammals and the more marine biology side of things, because my experience with Upwall was terrestrial.
Right.
So that's how I started, and having volunteered, then that developed into my undergraduate dissertation project. So just out of, I was interested, and through conversations and that I had with Janie Ray, the co-founder, we just developed a project and took it from there. And then I was continuously working with them over time. And then that led into the master's.
Right. Oh, that's great. I realized marine science was kind of always your passion. So it sounds like just getting to go out there was kind of what triggered, the rest of what's going to be your career now. So it does kind of show the importance of those, those projects that at the time don't seem so central, and then they totally change the direction that you go in.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I've got a very technical question about this this very isolated research center. So how do you access kind of basic necessities, food, water? How do you kind of, the day-to-day life there, how does that work?
Yeah, good question. It's easier said than done, for sure. So the way that we get food deliveries is, how do we get them again? Oh yeah, so we get grocery orders just put on a ferry from Prince Rupert, which is the nearest city up north. They travel down on the ferry into Hartley Bay, the nearest point of contact to us, the Gitgat village. And from there, we have to go on our research vessel, about 45-minute boat ride to go pick up the groceries and then bring them back. And then it's a case of fireman's chain loading the groceries up into the cabin. And drinking water is something that we try and collect from the creeks locally, so that we're not having to rely on going in and out of Hartley Bay by boat, which of course is more fuel for an engine. So we try and just get the water as close to the cabin as we can.
Wow. Okay. Sounds like there's a lot of adaptations to regular life to make, but I'm sure it's a very beautiful place to spend 6 months. I'm really impressed at you being out there for 6 months last summer, but sounds like you got a lot out of it. So thank you so much for sharing this experience with us, talking to us a bit more about it and letting people ask some questions. As we're wrapping up, just wanted to ask if there's kind of anything or anyone you'd like to mention, social media or otherwise, just before we wrap up.
Yeah, sure. So definitely, I think checking out the BC Whales website if you're interested in more of the work that's going on, because of course I've really only spoken about my work, but there's a ton of other amazing research going on. Acoustics work with the hydrophone network, a whole bunch of other things. So the website is bcwhales.org, and I think that's definitely if you're interested in whale research on the coast of BC, definitely a good one to check out. And they also, I mean, BC Whales, there's an Instagram, and then of course my own Instagram if you're interested in looking at some of my work in particular, which is right. Éadin_O'Mahony.
And Aideen's Instagram is also at the end of her lecture to help you spell it. So you can go find those at the end of her XC2 lecture. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, not only to give us this lecture and talk to us a bit more about the research that you're doing with whales, which is really cool. And honestly, I'd love to see you fly a drone through whale spray, but also taking the time to answer some questions and chat with us this morning. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.